so why do you want it? Wait. Wait. Okay, I'm about to get to a meeting in like 15 minutes. When we finish, when we close. I said, call me a video. I'm about to
go to.
Oh, wow, that's a problem.
Yeah.
How can I transfer? God damn. Wait, 1 second.
Sound check 1 2. Sound check 1 2 is the sound sounding better online.
Let me send you a link. Tell me if you can. Yes, let me send you a link.
No?
I want you to.
Can somebody assign me as interpreter French? I'm on the platform.
Yes.
Please, can the host assign me as interpreter? French Arabic. English Arabic.
sorted. So from the room, it's okay, we can hear you. But from the other side, we can hear you. So starting in the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Hello? You know, I think we should we should put the spotlight only on the person that is speaking.
Okay.
Because now I'm saying like you put spotlight on those two are showing. I think they shouldn't. Because I think when you add them to the spotlight when maybe they want to speak. I don't know how we can do it. I don't know how we can do that because you see, because
Okay, so for now, the spotlight is the conference room.
the conference room.
Okay.
I think yes, the conference room. Yeah, remove those two for now,
Yeah.
and remove those two for now. And I think there's an introduction from from the room. After the room, we can add them to the spot. I don't know how we can do that. Is when they start talking, they be add to the spotlights when they start talking.
Okay.
I know there's something we call dynamic spotlight. I don't know how to call it.
Let me check for that feature, but in the meantime, I'll just leave the off spotlight until they start talking.
Okay. They are all spotlight. Okay. Let's leave it like this for now.
Okay.
This is better. Yes.
Alright.
Me, I'm going live. I'm already live, so I think let's keep it like that. I'll just use yeah.
Recording in progress.
round of introduction and know who's in the room. If we can just start from the back, please tell us who you are and the organization that you're representing, if possible, was portfolio. While we're waiting for William, so that at least let me also Is this okay now? Okay. So, William is here. I suppose we don't have to like to introduce him anymore. Once again, good afternoon, friends, excellencies, comrades, and welcome to today's event. Today's event is a symposium where we're going to discuss the possibility of a renewed United Nations Charter through what is known as Article 109. I'm not going to immediately say much about Article 109, as the entire conversation this afternoon will go into details on what this Article 109 is and the promise of a renewed United Nations that it brings. The event today has been organized by our host, the AU ECOSOC, our AU ECOSOC, and Article 109, which is a coalition of international, global, local civil society that are trying to work on ensuring that the UN Charter is reviewed. Through Article 109, which is a conference. I will not go into details on the objectives of today's meeting, but suffice to say that our objective for putting together this meeting revolves around two critical questions. The first question is that the United Nations, as it stands today, still remains very relevant to our work. It also remains very relevant to ensuring that there is a United Nation that is working on am I loud now? Am I loud now? Can you hear me? Okay, so I was saying the objectives of our meeting today revolves around two critical questions. That the United Nations, through its mandate, remains very relevant to all of us. As some of you are aware, the United Nations has three mandates. The first mandate is that it works to deliver on development. It also works to deliver on human rights. And the third one is on international peace and security. However, despite what the United Nations has achieved over many years, including the fact that many of us are independent because of the existence of the United Nations. You know, statehood is given by the United Nations, and several other achievements that the United Nations has been able to deliver on. We find the United Nations everywhere. I'm sure even here in Zambia, you have UNDP, you have UNICEF, various programs that are being undertaken by the United Nations as an institution. It still remains very relevant. However, over the years, there's been several efforts in reforming the United Nations because of the recognition that despite the achievements that the United Nations has been able to, the United Nations has also had several failures. I mentioned that the mandate of the United Nations is peace and security. Yet, increasingly, we continue witnessing wars and many conflicts across the globe. I also mentioned that the United Nations was put in place in order to ensure that the human rights are upheld and protected, and yet the human rights agenda is still critically violated, and we continue witnessing that. Development as well, the same thing. So the failures of the United Nations are many, but one of the failures is the reality that when the United Nations was put in place, when the Charter was adopted in 1945, several countries did not take part, and Africa as a continent was severely underrepresented. The United Nations adoption through the San Francisco conference, the adoption conference, we only had 4 African countries present there, and the 4 countries being Liberia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and apartheid South Africa. The creation of the United Nations, the structure of the United Nations had Africa not being there. And because of this structure that doesn't really speak, and at the time didn't speak to the aspirations of Africans, we've continued witnessing a situation where Africa's voice within the United Nations, and it's very systematic. Africa's voice within the United Nations is very limited. It remains an institution that's very unequal, where just a tiny few countries are making decisions on behalf of the rest of the world. Suffice to say that the United Nations itself, the creation of the United Nations itself, was a radical act. You know, a radical act in the sense that with the creation of the United Nations, countries decided at that point in time to give up certain elements of their sovereignty. They surrendered, and we all did, as we became members of the United Nations, we surrendered to certain decisions. Countries decided at that point in time made by a global authority. So the failures of the United Nations are there for all of us to see. And now we are at a point in time where we have to recognize that this body, as important as it is, it really needs reform in order for it to not only democratize and ensure that there is equity in terms of decision making, but also that the United Nations delivers. We have lined up a program of 2 hours with 3 distinct panels. The first panel will be discussing what the United Nations means to Africa and to civil society. And then the second part of the program, we want to talk about how we can be involved in this call to reform the United Nations Charter through Article 109. The third part of our program we will try and look at actions, you know, the way forward. How do we and where are the avenues of action? What can we do? This meeting today is among friends, although we have excellences among us. The aim is mostly to raise awareness among civil society, ourselves, civil society, as well as African civil society. Allow me to do what I should have done when I took the mic. Allow me to introduce myself. Yeah, I forgot about myself. Allow me to introduce myself. So my name is Brenda Morphia. I am an African, unapologetically feminist, and I'm unapologetically Pan-Africanist. I work for Oxfam International. I represent Oxfam at the United Nations, so I'm based in New York. I'm representing the entire confederation of 21 organizations that are working to fight inequality and bring justice in order to fight, to combat poverty. Oxfam, like many other organizations, has 79 country presence programs. So we actually, when handbike therapies in Oxfam. In addition to country programs, we also have presence at multilateral level and regional levels. So we have presence not only
in New York, targeted to the United Nations, but we also have presence in Addis Ababa, targeting the African Union. We also have presence in Geneva and Washington, D.C. In addition to that, I am part of the Article 109. I was one of the co-conveners of the conference that decided to create this coalition. I also serve as a committee member, a steering committee member of another coalition, an initiative called Coalition for the UN Renewed, which is C for UN. So having said that, allow me now to call for welcome remarks. Mine were just introduction remarks. So the welcome remarks from our host, and William, after you've spoken, I'll also give Ambassador to rest. So should we go with you or let Ambassador give us a few? Okay. Well, William, over to you.
You don't joke with money.
Thank you very much. And yes, Sister Anderson, she has not done a welcome remarks. It was very workshop. I think that was way more than welcome remarks. I think we already have a better understanding of the purpose of us being here with that welcome remarks, quote unquote, introduction. But let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to this important symposium, but more importantly, to welcome you to the ECOSOC Secretariat. I'm pretty sure some of you, this is the first time visiting our facility, but this is your facility. The Secretariat is for all civil society organizations, and we therefore have an open gate policy, not open door, because you have to come through the gate. So it is an open gate policy. So please, you're welcome. But more importantly is to welcome you to the Symposium, Renewing the United Nations Charter 2, Article 109, organized, like Brenda rightly said, by African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, the Article 109 Coalition, Trust Africa, and other partners that have been working behind the scene. We basically gather at a crucial juncture in our global history where the call for reforms and revitalization of international governance system is more pressing than ever. As we reflect on the importance of the United Nations, especially looking at the values it embodies, we must also recognize the need to adapt its principles and practices to the realities of the 21st century. Article 109 of the UN Charter basically provides us with a framework for the necessary renewal. And I think this is a unique opportunity for member states to convene and consider amendments to the Charter with the goal of enhancing the effectiveness and the responsiveness of the United Nations to the needs of all people. And therefore, our collective voices as citizens and civil society organizations can play a vital role in this process. And that is the reason why we're having this conversation. Civil society organizations, both those who are online and those who are with us, small facility. Like Brenda said, the purpose of this symposium, in my view, is not merely to raise awareness about the critical issues we are talking about, but to galvanize our collective effort. And I believe together we can mobilize citizens' voices across our communities to engage our government in advocating
for this agenda at a multilateral level. But it has to start from home. We need to take ownership as people working in the civic space. The changes we seek are only possible when we unite around our shared vision for a more equitable, just, and responsive legal governance system. And therefore, I want to encourage all of you to participate actively in this discussion today. Let us share our insights, our strategies, and our aspirations, and work together to amplify our voices. And I strongly believe that it is through collaboration and determination that we can reshape the future of our multilateral system. I want to thank you very much for your presence and for making time to be with us here, and your commitment, which is more important to this cause. I think this is the time we need to go back and begin to do the things that we have not done, and therefore let us get work started. We need to really get all our hands on deck and see how we can push this agenda. So I'll stop here and then give the mic to Ambassador Lazarus, who has been one of our distinguished ambassadors, but also have worked extensively within the AU system and also the UN system, and has played a critical role in some of our continental agenda, and has also championed some of those critical issues even at the UN level. And I think it's only befitting to have him to share a word or two, but more importantly to also bring that perspective and experience that we will all work together, both from the side of citizens and those who have actually been on the other side of policy making, so that collaboratively we can bring our ideas and put ideas together to see how we push the agenda. So allow me to hand over the mic to Ambassador Lazarus for a word or two. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I don't want to waste your time by reintroducing myself. So I would like to go straight to the subject that has brought us together here. I like to work the way our medical professionals work. They first begin by diagnosing the problem. Everything starts with that investigation, because how they diagnose will impact on how they are going to cure the problem. And I would like us to take that example when we come to this symposium. Ask ourselves, what is the mischief, as the lawyers would say, that we are trying to cure? It is important to understand that the United Nations and the United Nations Charter are two different things. They are not one and the same. Of the United Nations, or it is about review of the Charter. Now, what is the difference? If we find that the way the Charter is currently written obstructs the work of the United Nations, and in any way defeats the attainment of the objectives of the United Nations, then our efforts will be directed, or should be directed, at renewing the Charter and looking at those aspects of the Charter that are preventing us from attaining the objectives of the UN, or obstructing or creating inefficiencies in the attainment of the Charter or of the objectives of the UN. But if the issue is that we believe the United Nations requires to be reformed, then we should concentrate our efforts insofar as Africa is concerned. The little history I know about our efforts has been not so much directed at reforming the Charter, but at reforming the United Nations. And in this respect, the first fully organized effort by Africa to reform the United Nations is the Harare Declaration of 1997. You will recall that in 1979, African countries moved to include an item on the agenda of the UN, which was called the reform of the Security Council. But even if they moved this motion to add to the agenda, they did not have a fully coordinated African common position. They were reactive mostly, and they were making complaints about the various aspects of the United Nations in which they felt they were underrepresented. But the very first effort, when they actually had a platform agreed at summit level, was the Harare Declaration in 1997 on the reform of the United Nations, although the emphasis was mostly on the reform of the Security Council. And in 2005, they decided to improve upon their 1997 declaration. The declaration itself came as a response to the proposals that were made to reform the United Nations by Secretary General Kofi Annan. He made these various proposals and options, which then required the Africans to respond like all the other regions. And so at their summit in Harare in 1997, the heads of state formally responded by having an African common position. But through efforts to reform, to negotiate that reform, they discovered that there were aspects to the Harare Declaration that would create very difficult problems in the negotiations. And so they decided to improve upon that, and that is how come they had what we call the Ezulwini Consensus. Much of what is known about the Ezulwini Consensus and CERT
Recording in progress.
But when you read those documents fully, you realize that there is also the reform generally of the United Nations. And that includes the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions. It includes the reform of the General Assembly, of procedure, etc., etc. So, this symposium, in order for it to strike the right balance, it has to identify the mischief that it is seeking. If you look at Article 109, paragraph 2, subparagraph 2, for instance, that is an example of a situation where you are reforming or reviewing the charter because there is something in that paragraph or section which creates problems for countries like ours. It introduces a veto in the reform process. because Section 2 of 109 is talking about including the concurrence of all the permanent members in order for the charter to be reviewed, which means it introduces a veto. Unless every member of the the permanent members agreed, then the review could not be considered as successful. So if we find those kinds of clauses, we might say, well, then what we need to do is review the charter in order to make it easier for decision-making to happen, whether we are dealing with reform of the United Nations itself, or just the Security Council, or any other aspect of the United Nations. So we as citizens need to reflect on that and have specific points. There might be points where we are aiming to reform the charter, but there may also be points where we are seeking to reform the United Nations, either in terms of its structures or aspects of the United Nations. And as you know, when we talk about the United Nations, we are also talking about the Bretton Woods institutions, which are part of the United Nations. The question is, are we going to wait until we have comprehensive reform proposals for everything in the United Nations? Or are we going to proceed by permanent cycles of reform, but taking one bit at a time? These would be my introductory to the symposium as you decide where you want to concentrate your efforts. Please bear in mind, identify the mischief that you want to address, but also don't confuse the Charter and the United Nations. They are two different things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You've raised a lot of questions, which we will be going into details on. Colleagues, I didn't acknowledge the presence of our online participants. We have more than 100 people that are joining us online. Yeah, so we're moving on to our first panel. In our first panel, we would like to introduce Article 109, and I suppose our panelists will go into details on some of the issues that Ambassador Kapambwe has already introduced, you know, the issues of the veto and so on and so forth. So my first speaker is Eba Ali. Eba Ali is a Canadian Egyptian journalist who is now the director of Article 109. In the interest of time, Heba, unfortunately, I won't introduce you in more details than that, but we'll definitely share all the panelists' bios after the meeting, so that you know who Heba, what else Heba has done. But she's the right person, actually, to be leading this coalition of citizens of the world that are trying to review, reimagine the charter. Heba, please tell us about Article 109, and then when you're done, I'll introduce Professor Tim Murithi. And you may want perhaps to also touch on the issue of mischief that Ambassador Lars has mentioned. I'm not sure whether you actually want to make that distinction as well, on whether we want to reform the UN or we want to review the charter. I would say for me, it's one. but over to you. Please tell us, both the UN and the charter need to be reformed. Charter is defining what the UN is doing, but over to you, Heba.
There seems to be a sound issue. Can you hear us from that side? Hello?
Well, I can hear you, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yes, but Brenda, can you hear us in the room?
That's a good question.
We can't hear you anymore. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
So we can hear Prof, but we can't hear Heba. So yeah. So perhaps we can start with you, Professor Tim.
Sure.
Yes.
Maybe Heber, you can sign out and sign back in again. That could be the issue. Yes,
yeah.
happy to start. And mine is very short, if I may.
Yes.
You can hear me, I hope. Yes. So greeting, colleagues. I would just like to add my word of appreciation to AU ECOSOC and partners for this joint convening with the Article 109. Thank you very much, Ambassador William, Dr. Raj, Ambassador Lazarus, and of course, our gracious moderator, Ms. Brenda Mofia, who is also, I should mention, on the steering committee of the Article 109 Coalition. So she's very much one of the conveners, the initial conveners of this coalition, and we should acknowledge that. So mine is very brief. Mine was to try to touch upon why Africa as a continent should actually take on the responsibility to transform global order. And Africa as a continent has endured the invasion and incursion into its lands and societies. We know the transatlantic slave trade transferred African bodies to build the industrial empires of Europe and North America. Colonialism, apartheid, oppressed and suppressed Africans in their own land. It left deep psychological scars that are recorded, and I would say are still stored at a very deep cellular memory within us as Africans, relating to the human rights violations, killings, mutilations, torture, rape, and theft of resources from the African continent. This legacy, I would argue, has perpetuated Africa's own internalized self-hate and built psychological wars of suspicions towards our fellow Africans. And we as African people have a lot of work to do to address the manifest self-hate and psychological mistrust towards our fellow Africans that is evident in the devastating wars that are killing our people, the massive corruption that is extracting resources from our continent, and the internal challenges of our own governing institutions, both nationally and continentally. In 1945, there were only 4 African countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, Liberia, and apartheid South Africa, as Brenda mentioned, that were present at the time that the current multilateral system was designed during the United Nations Conference on International Organization, which was held in San Francisco. 50 out of those 54 countries that subsequently emerged out of European colonies that were controlled by United Kingdom, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, they were not involved in writing the rules of the current multilateral system. 50 out of 54 African countries were not involved in writing the rules of the current multilateral system. Here's the mischief, Ambassador Lazarus, at least one of them. And within this multilateral system, the paternalistic attitudes, the colonial attitudes of the countries of the global north have persisted towards Africa and Africans in the diaspora. The colonial attitude that continues to treat Africans as less than human persists today in the global north, and it persists in the multilateral system. And here is another mischief that I note. Nowhere is this more stark than in the United Nations Security Council, where Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, 18% of the world's population, 28%, almost a third of the membership of the 193 member states of the United Nations, does not have a permanent membership with veto powers at the UN Security Council. This is another mischief I would point to, Ambassador Lazarus. While the former colonial powers of Britain and France, with only 67 million people each, both have permanent membership within the United Nations Security Council with veto powers. If there was ever a need for a stark example of a multilateral security system that is insidiously out of whack with the realities of the 21st century, there you have it. And there is another point of mischief I would point to. The UN Security Council is now dysfunctional, discredited, and I would argue even dangerous towards humanity. The UN Security Council is unable to address the devastating conflicts in Sudan, Sahel, Somalia, Eastern DRC, Mozambique. It failed to prevent what the United Nations Independent International Community on the occupied territories, led by Judge Navi Pillay of South Africa, identified in its report described as genocide in Gaza following the Israel military occupation of that territory. Russia was president of the United Nations Security Council in February 2022 when it launched its invasion of Ukraine. I believe the mischief is piling up here. All of this exposes that an unreformed United Nations Security Council is a clear and present danger to humanity, and some are even more inclined to describe it as a UN Insecurity Council. Our call to action to the African citizens to invoke and convene a general conference to review the United Nations Charter through Article 109 is so much more, though, about UN Security Council reform, as has been discussed earlier. It is also about transforming the global financial architecture embodied in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, which have also wreaked havoc on the African continent through their structural adjustment programs. Here again, the mischief multiplies. The IMF has admitted to this in its own 4-page report published by its own internal personnel called Neoliberalism Oversold. Google that on your phones, which admits that the policies that it was pursuing and pushing onto countries in the global south, particularly in Africa, did not deliver in the expected manner, and it undermined the economies of these countries. Today, we are laden with Africa's debt burden, which is the result of higher interest rates targeted at the African continent, which is demanding African governments to pay more in debt service payments than they spend on education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure development for their own people. A situation that is not only mischievous, but it is unjust and perverse. The paternalistic colonial attitude is also alive and well in these international financial institutions, which were created through processes that were convened by the United Nations multilateral system. I'm going to start to wrap up shortly. 2026 to 2036 has been designated as the decade of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparation. And AU, ECOSOC, AU, CEDAW are leading on this agenda, and we look forward to working with them on this. And so we need to build a pan-African, global African solidarity networks with our sisters and brothers in the diaspora, including 22 million Africans and descendants in the Caribbean, 40 million African Americans, 100 million Afro-Latinos in Latin America, most of who were and are there because of the transatlantic slave trade. Africa and her diaspora have the opportunity to contribute towards remaking the world order in a meaningful way that genuinely includes the voices of African people and also addresses the mountain of mischief that is now accumulated over decades. The transformation of the multilateral system is not a matter of charity. I'm ending, Brenda, through which Africans are being given a handout. It is a matter of human right and an affirmation of our common humanity. We have to fight for this reform. An off-planet observer who was casually passing by the planet would be shocked at what they see, how we have divided ourselves into artificial borders, 193 states spending 22 trillion to build armies and weapon systems to fight each other in perpetual wars of destruction. And I end by saying our call to action to invoke Article 109 to convene a general conference to review the United Nations Charter is precisely to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, as was outlined at the beginning of the UN Charter. We are now summoned to take on this noble cause and do the necessary work of raising awareness, advocating, analyzing, debating the urgent need for us to renew the United Nations through invoking Article 109. And I end with the powerful words of the freedom fighter and Pan-Africanist Nelson Mandela, who inspired us when he said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you very much, Prof. Let's try if we can get hold of Heba now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Good. Well, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to Ambassador Carew, to Dr. Raj, to the AU cluster chairs who are with us today, to Professor Tim, our senior advisor, to you, Brenda, as a member of our steering committee, and to everyone who's joined online and in person. So I'm going to give you a bit of a presentation just to walk you through the basics of how Article 109 works and the momentum that we've built, and hopefully answer some of the questions posed both by Ambassador Kapambwe and by some of the questions already in the chat. So I won't repeat what Tim has shared in terms of the critique of the United Nations. I think he's made a strong case as to why the Security Council needs reform. But I would add a few motivations that go beyond the Security Council. First, we face new threats like climate change, like artificial intelligence, that the UN is not currently well equipped to address, and that I might add are likely to hit the African continent hardest or leave the African continent furthest behind. And in fact, the word environment does not appear in the UN Charter whatsoever. And as a reflection of this, the focus in the Charter on national borders, on national sovereignty, reflects a World War II view of the world, whereas today we live in an interdependent world in which national sovereignty has to be balanced with the reality that one country's fossil fuel production or migration policy or disease control system can have an impact on everyone else. So there's a mismatch in the core principles of our international relations between that supremacy of national sovereignty and the interconnected world in which we live, where we need collective solutions for the provision of global public goods. And third, and please let me know if you're having any trouble seeing the slides. I hope that's all right. At a time when people power can have more impact than national policy making, we the peoples, the famous opening words of the UN Charter, have very little voice at the UN. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, and Tim has already covered this, we see many new powers emerging in the world, and yet the UN is still run by 5 countries who won a war 80 years ago. And as you'll see here, and as Tim mentioned, only 4 African countries were present when the charter was signed. Much of the continent was still colonized. So this is also a matter of representation and of having a voice at the table. So for all these reasons, we would argue that the global governance we have today is akin to using a typewriter in a smartphone world, and it's time for a software upgrade. Now, to respond to Ambassador Kapambwe's point directly, and I would agree with you on this, Brenda, we seek to reform the UN Charter in order to reform the UN. And that is because a lot of the challenges facing the UN are embedded in the Charter itself. And I'll come to that in a moment. But essentially, today, the UN, despite longstanding critique, is really facing an existential moment because a lot of these calls for reform are coming to a head. And it, of course, limped into its 80th birthday this year, battered, broke, and beset by the crises that it was meant to prevent. And you'll see here some thoughts from a former special assistant to the late Secretary General Kofi Annan saying, in all my years, I've never been so pessimistic about the UN. We don't have time for incrementalism anymore. It's reform or die now. And the words of Richard Gowan, a UN analyst at the International Crisis Group, who says that in 10 years, the UN could be reduced to a skeleton. And so it's perhaps no surprise that UN reform dominated the discourse at the recent UN General Assembly in New York, and we did a data-driven linguistic analysis of all the world leader speeches, and our research shows that more than 78% of speeches mentioned the word reform, meaning it featured more than references to climate change, to Palestine, or to Ukraine. Of them, 57%, so more than 100 countries, called for Security Council reform specifically, and 30 countries critiqued the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council or called for its abolishment altogether. So I want to share with you a few of those speeches just to give you a sense of the demand that is out there for more comprehensive reform of the UN. We heard the president of Liberia saying, we call for a UN that's more responsive and reflective of today's world. Yes?
Amy? We
Yes?
can't see any slides. You mentioned that you're showing your slides. We can't see any slides.
All right, let's see here. I don't know if on, I see. Yes, indeed. Okay, let me fix that. I think it was disabled at some point. Is that better? Can you see them now?
Yes.
Good.
We can see.
Thanks. Okay, so these are the words of the Liberian president saying that using outdated 1945 solutions to tackle 2025 challenges is neither reasonable nor realistic. And this is where, to come back to your question, Ambassador Kapambwe, we start to see why reform of the Charter is important for reform of the United Nations. We heard from the president of Sierra Leone calling for us to build a UN that is more representative, more responsive, more resilient, saying the UN does not need a louder UN, it requires a braver UN, and that UN must work for people, peace, and planet. The president of Ghana talked about the charter itself as outdated when it comes to representation and noted that the most powerful World War II countries are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And while she's not African, I like to think of her as an honorary African. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, said, "It is not beyond us to forge a better world that is fair and just. 80 years ago, it was just a few countries that summoned that will. And today, those of us who were denied the right to be heard then must be at the core of a new clarion call." And finally, President Ruto of Kenya said, "We have no choice but to reject outdated systems and reimagine a framework of international cooperation that works for everyone." I will add that he also threatened that Kenya would lead a delegation of African countries that would withdraw from the United Nations if there was no Security Council reform. So we're seeing now, as I say, something of a tipping point in terms of the pressure on reform. And this is a view that is shared by the public as well. We commissioned a poll in more than 100 countries with more than 117,000 people. And you can see here across the board, both in Africa and beyond, that a majority of respondents say the UN needs reform, and it is only a vast minority that think it is working well as it is. So if there is real consensus on the need for deep reform, the question is how. And this is where, again, Ambassador, thank you for the provocation, but I think where it becomes very clear as to why we need to go back to the Charter itself. Many of the efforts today to reform the UN are focused around one of 4 things. first, structures. So for example, merging UN agencies. Second, procedures. So for instance, how to streamline the many UN mandates that exist. Third, costs. And here we've seen a real focus on how to find savings in the system. And fourth, to a lesser extent, I would argue culture. For instance, how the Secretary General can be more bold. But none of those reforms address what I would argue, I think what we would argue, is the underlying causes of the UN's dysfunction. And those are baked into the Charter's very foundations. And they are the veto power, they are the normative and conceptual mismatch that I mentioned earlier between a World War II architecture and view of the world and the world of today. And therefore, our coalition proposes this more ambitious approach to reform, one that is built into the Charter itself. Now, we've talked about Article 109 in some depth already, so I won't go into too much detail other than to clarify, because I know there are many questions around the P5 blockage, that to be invoked, the review process requires support from 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly and any 9 of 15 members of the Security Council, meaning it is actually one of the rare mechanisms that is not initially subject to a P5 veto. So we can go ahead and call a review conference with 2/3 majority, and in our outreach and diplomatic work, we can see that even if you just take the 2/3 of the membership that wasn't present in 1945, you could quite easily reach that majority. Indeed, paragraph 2 does talk about the need for any changes that emerge from a charter review process to be ratified by the P5 to take effect. And I'll come back to that question in just a minute. But I think what's important here is to really emphasize that the charter was always meant to be a living document. The US president, when the charter was adopted in 1945, Harry Truman, specifically said that it would be expanded and improved as time goes on, and that changing world conditions would require readjustment. And so our argument is, if now is not the time for readjustment, when you have nuclear powers threatening openly to use their weapons, when you have climate catastrophe, when you have unregulated AI threatening our cognitive security, when you have an increase in conflicts that the Security Council, as Tim outlined, is clearly incapable of managing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the systems are clearly not working. Now, to spend a minute on this question of the risks of the process, because I know that that is top of mind for many people. Is the P5 veto an obstacle to delivery? Now, the first point I would make here is it's actually in the interest of the powerful countries to engage in this process. Because if they don't, and here remember what President Ruto of Kenya said, if countries are so frustrated by the way the United Nations is working today, they may well disengage and go do their business elsewhere. And we're already seeing that happening in the BRICS, in the G20, in these different formations. And now there's a risk that that happens in a more formal way. And so in order to protect a model or a framework in which they have relative power, it is in their interest to give up some of that power. Second, there's a real political cost to blockage. So yes, they have that power to block changes, but it will cost them. And the more we can create a majority of countries that are pushing for change, the higher that political cost is. Third, I'll point out the P5 are not a homogeneous group. They don't agree on everything. There are some things that certain members of the P5 may want and others won't. And here that gives us a bit of room to play. And we have heard from various members of the P5 in our many discussions that there could be an interest in different parts of this agenda. And just a last point on that the benefit of a broader review process is that you create some space for negotiation, whereby if France is interested in creating a climate council as an example, it may be willing to give up something on Security Council reform in order to get something in another area of interest, and so on and so forth. We have seen historical examples that where the P5 might block initially, as a new administration comes in, ratification does take place. We've also seen examples where big agreements have gone through despite opposition from the P5, and here the landmine ban treaty is a good example. And finally, I think it's important for us to remember that regardless of the outcome, a review process in itself has benefits because it allows all of the grievances that I think many African countries in particular have to be aired and heard. And it creates a new normal in which there is an expectation for change. And some of those ideas may go on to take a life of their own in other fora. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to be quick in just touching on another concern that we often hear from the African continent in particular, which is, would Article 109, i.e. a very ambitious and broad-based reform process, be a distraction from a more targeted approach to Security Council reform? And here I would ask, does Africa want a seat at a broken table? And I would argue the Security Council, as others have pointed out, is currently quite broken. Or does it want to be part of shaping a whole new table and shaping what the next world order might look like? So we have a strategic opportunity here to be even more ambitious in the kind of influence that Africa can have on the world stage. But secondly, we would argue that a charter review process would actually accelerate movement towards Security Council reform because it acts as a forcing function whereby these ongoing discussions that we've had at the IGN are forced to come to a conclusion in order to have a position ready for the review conference timing. There are other concerns around the timing, but I won't go through them now. Happy to engage in some of that during the discussion. Just to say that the risk calculus that we have come to, which is that the risks of the status quo are much greater than the risks of moving forward in having a structured and inclusive conversation about the kind of multilateralism we want, is one that has led many to support this idea of invoking Article 109 from around the world, including Nobel laureates, including former heads of state. And we've seen real momentum. Sorry, I'm just going to skip forward. Starting last year at the UN General Assembly, whereby the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, became the first sitting head of state to call for a comprehensive review of the charter. A couple of months later, he was joined by the heads of South Africa and India in specifically saying we cannot wait for another global tragedy like the Second World War to build a new global governance on its ruins. And at this year's UN General Assembly, we saw many other countries come forward in support of the idea of invoking Article 109, from Honduras to North Macedonia to Kazakhstan and the Gambia. We've also been having diplomatic roundtables with many regional groups, including the CARICOM Caribbean group and some members of the African group, and have seen a lot of interest from several African countries on this agenda. Very briefly, our coalition exists in order to try to mobilize this support and convince governments to move forward with this agenda, in part by building a popular movement to support that effort. And our vision, and this may disappoint some of you, is not to push forward specific reforms, but to drive the process. And so we have a vision of a more equitable and effective global governance system that would achieve 5 things. And I'll list them, but it will be up to governments and to each segment of society to come up with their own ideas of what those specific reforms might be. We hope that overall, any outcomes will allow the UN to deliver on its core purpose of maintaining peace and security. And here we've seen ideas around limiting the use and scope of the veto, that it will enable the UN to address emerging challenges like climate change and artificial intelligence. And we've seen ideas like establishing a climate council alongside the Security Council to more actively engage on climate issues. And that it should distribute power more equitably among states. And here there are, of course, many proposals for Security Council reform, but also in shifting the power from the Security Council to the General Assembly, where every country has a vote. Finally, that a revised UN Charter should usher in greater respect for international law and human rights, and more meaningfully include non-state actors in global governance. And here we've seen ideas such as the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. We tried to mobilize this effort in 3 ways: by mobilizing member states, and we've now briefed, actually this needs to be updated, but more than 35% of the UN membership, and are looking to build support and coalitions among member states. We're trying to build a movement, and here I hope we'll have some interesting discussion around how the African public can contribute to that. And finally, we're trying to normalize the idea of charter reform in the public discourse. And so, to end, because I know we are a bit late and it'd be great to spend more time on discussion, here's the proposed timeline that we have in mind. And this, of course, will depend on many factors of which we are not in control. I've just lost video of the conference room, so I hope you can all still hear us and see us. But we hope that next year we'll be in a position to launch a group of friends of member states to create an informal environment in which countries and governments can discuss and strategize around this issue. That by 2027, and this is, I'd say, the most ambitious agenda or timeline, but as early as 2027, that countries would feel confident to introduce a vote at the UN General Assembly in support of Article 109. Then we would see a preparatory process with input from parliament, civil society, and other segments of society to ensure that there is ownership over what this new charter should deliver. And finally, that a review conference could begin as early as 2030 as part of the post-Sustainable Development Goals agenda. We're all trying to figure out what's going to be the next framework for international cooperation, and that this process could provide an answer. You'll see here some of the members of the coalition so far, and we hope that many of you in the room will consider joining, and my colleague will be here a bit later to tell you how you can do that. But these organizations span every region of the world and range from small local organizations to global campaigning organizations to peacebuilding organizations and everything in between. I'm going to skip forward as well and just give a quick, to lead into our discussion, a quick recap of some of what Professor Tim said around why this agenda should matter to Africa, and more than that, why Africa is well positioned to lead. First of all, clearly, the lack of representation in 1945, and if we go back to the words of Mia Motley saying those who weren't present then should be the ones driving the agenda now, I think we've got a very strong case for why Africa is well positioned. Secondly, of course, for many of us on the continent, development is a huge priority, and I cannot see how the continent can develop in the framework of an inequitable global governance system. Partly because the development systems we have no teeth. So if you look at the Economic and Social Council, for instance, but also because so long as certain countries are locked into the bottom of the geopolitical food chain, it will be impossible for them to ever be able to stand on their own 2 feet. As I mentioned earlier, I think the continent risks being hardest hit by climate change, or among the hardest hit, risks being among those left behind by artificial intelligence. And so if African countries can have a say in shaping governance of these issues, they can protect their own citizens in the long term. There is the opportunity for accelerated movement towards Security Council reform, and as I mentioned earlier, a strategic opportunity to really shape the next world order. And finally, the African bloc in the UN membership makes up more than a quarter of the total. So that is a huge segment of the votes, and if used strategically, can have a huge impact. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion. And thank you very much for your interest and for your provocative questions. Over to you, Brenda.
Heba. And let me just add a couple of things to your last slide. Why Africa should lead. I think why Africa should lead is because Africa has had experience in overhauling institutions. We as Africans were able to go back to the drawing tables in 2000 and transformed our continental body from OAU to AU. A new thinking and a new reality that powerfully reflected on the failures and gains, and were able to come up with a new organization with a new charter altogether. I think this is one of the things and the experience that Africa can bring to the UN. The UN Charter Review through Article 109, if I may, is a process that more or less speaks to an opportunity to change a constitution. We're in Zambia right now, and there's a lot of conversations around the constitutional change, the constitutional review. So we're looking at the charter as our constitution. This is the global constitution. More than anyone, Africa has had a lot of experience, and Africa fully understands the need to go back to the Grundnorm and making sure that the Grundnorm reflects what Africans want. The second issue that I would want to add also is that when the charter was put in place in was adopted in 1945, it was through a conference, right? That conference brought together, and I'm not talking about countries, but the number of delegates, it brought together 850 official delegates at the time, and only 21 were women. So as women, I think this is another core. We have a charter which was put in place by men. So we're looking at an opportunity to begin going back and ensuring that the voice of women is heard. So much, Heba and team. Yeah. I know that Heba has to leave, but I think we need to, in the interest of time, I would suggest that we move on to the next panel discussion before we open up for question and answer. Do we have Briggs Bomber on the group or on the online? So our next panel will be talking about mobilizing African civil society to build a movement on Article 109. Briggs, can we have a sense whether we can see that we have somebody from Trust Africa, but we don't know whether it's Briggs Bomber. Okay. Do we have Sanusha? Oh, yes.
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Okay. So, Sanusha, please tell us, how can we mobilize the African citizens around Article 109?
Firstly, let me say thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, this is my first time engaging on this discussion, so it's really informative and really insightful for me. And I want to thank the presenters before me. For me, I think one of the things that is really interesting, and I will speak more from a South African perspective, if that's okay, so that I don't necessarily make generalizations and assumptions about how this could actually be a bigger and broader context. What we do find in the South African context is that from a South African perspective, civil society has played a critical role on South Africa's engagements at the global governance level, particularly in terms of adherence to the normative rules-based system, our kind of domestication of international law into our local, into our domestic legislation, particularly the International Criminal Court, and more importantly, in terms of adhering to some of those kinds of international normative spaces. And so you find that civil society has been very, very critical, it's been very vocal, and it's been very active in that space in terms of how the role of South Africa at the global level is domesticated in terms of our national legislature, but also in upholding and adhering to that. And this also came out not just in the ICC issue, where we have played a role, where civil society held the South African government accountable to the arrest warrant of the former president of Sudan, Bashir, and how that played out in the African Union conference that South Africa was hosting, but rather also in the context of bigger issues around trade, and in particular around the COVID-19 questions around the temporary waiver on IPOs with the vaccine question at the WTO. And that has been a very important space that civil society has occupied in South Africa in terms of pushing the kind of alignment between what are the domestic issues and how they align to South Africa's international global footprint, engagement, and so forth. It has not always been a space that has been comfortable. It has been a space that has also been conflictual at times. There's been tension around this. And I think this has now become part of the way in which the mobilization has happened. So based on that, I think one of the areas that we in South Africa, from both the civil society perspective, but also the think tank perspective, can actually be play a critical role, a significant role, is build up this momentum, particularly along the lines of how South Africa's role in terms of what Tim Heba put forward as very critical spaces to move forward on what does a review of the Charter mean, and particularly based on the role that South Africa has been playing in terms of the G20, which we're not sure whether we're going to be invited to the G20 now, given the context of what has happened, but also in terms of the role that South Africa has also taken on in the BRICS, but also in IPSA. And I think these are where some of the civil society spaces can become much more engaging. The think tank in particular, they also can play that role. And I don't want to take up too much of time, Chair, but I think the real issue is how do we galvanize, I think that was a word that was used, how do we galvanize that mobility of space to work with the regional bloc in terms of what is the role of African regional institutions, where South Africa and civil society are playing a critical role across the spectrum, and not just in terms of how this benefits South Africa. And I think that space is where we could definitely have much more engagement about conscientization around the role that we could benefit out of this in terms of the Pan-African Parliament, the issue of Order NEPAD, etc. But also, I think, in terms of the think tank space, it's how does this come back to the national development dynamic? And I think we could play that kind of mobilization at the national level. And I suspect that this is something that can have an important, significant impact, because one of the things that we've discovered in the think tank space after having to engage on a number of Think Tank 20 events and activities is that we do have partners in other countries, both in the Global South and the Global North, who are willing to also start engaging in those conversations. And one of those conversations that we took out from the Think Tank 20 was the relationship between particular actors that are sharing the similar kind of thinking about the UN reform system and the global governance architecture. And in that space, they are willing to engage on how to utilize our own engagement to build up that relationship. So I think civil society could definitely be an important benchmark and an important mover and shaker, if that's how I want to put it, in moving this discussion. But I think in terms of bringing it back to the national level and to the national dialogue, it has to feature in that space so that we can then build up the momentum and the traction going forward. And then lastly, I'll say, Chair, that I think the reason why we find ourselves in this kind of uncomfortable zone at times around the UN UN reform and the bigger global governance reform issues is that I think it's never been done. This is the only system we know right now. And so for the last 8 years, we've been dealing with the system. And I think that's the beauty of change, is that we go where we need to go, but it brings up some important dynamics where I think we can now see how it becomes favorable and impactful for us going forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Sanusha, and I'm glad that you managed to bring a very complex subject to a local conversation, where you were able to highlight how the global normatives have influenced our own local normatives and how domestication happens, and just the strength and understanding which we often fail to understand as citizens, that local is global and global is local, that the decisions and our representatives who carry the voice to the global represent us. At the same time, when they come with the decisions impact us. And at so many levels, when you sit down, you actually see that direct connection between what's happening locally and the decisions that are being made at the UN, which makes the UN our business. So thank you very much for raising that. It seems we do not have Briggs Bomber on the call, so let me just quickly invite.
I'm here, Brenda.
Sorry, okay. All right, Briggs, we can't see you, but over to you. How do you think we should mobilize the African civil society to build a movement on this Article 109, Briggs?
Thanks very much, Brenda, and greetings, colleagues, all protocols observed, and appreciation for creating this platform for what I believe is a very important conversation. I was connected earlier and managed to hear some of the foundation setting inputs from yourself as the chair, from Ambassador William, from Ambassador Kapambwe, as well as a team and others who spoke earlier. So I will not go into some of those details. Safe to say, we are at a moment of historic opportunity for us to be able to relook at global governance, global structures of governance in a way that redresses a historical injustice, but also a way that addresses the paralysis that we are seeing currently in multilateral institutions, in global cooperation, that has real life consequences for Africans and people of African descent. If you look at the impact of the paralysis of the Security Council at this particular moment in its failure to solve major conflicts, peace and security questions of the day, or its failure to help bring about a more just global financial architecture, resulting in billions of dollars leaving the continent that could be used to advance the continent's development. If we look at it in these particular ways, even if you look at, again, the failure of global cooperation when it comes to the question of the climate catastrophe that we are faced with today, it becomes very obvious that this is not just an intellectual conversation. It's not just a high-level diplomatic type of engagement, but this is a conversation that has real consequences on the everyday lived realities of African people. And I think if we look at it from that particular perspective, it becomes obvious that what we need are more than technical solutions. And I think if we look at just the inputs that we have received today, we are not short of technical ideas of how to go about bringing a more just global order, a more just UN, or a UN that's up to date for the needs of the 21st century. We need to go beyond thinking about the technical solutions and really look at the question of political will.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
And if we are looking at the question of political will, you will appreciate then that it takes movements to bring about political will. That is the lesson that we have learned historically when our political leaders, when our ruling elites have not had the courage, have not had the will to move. They were compelled to move when you've had movements, when you've had a social base that's backing a demand. A good example is the anti-apartheid struggle itself. You would remember that for the United States of America under Reagan to pass a sanctions act against South Africa, it took massive mobilization, citizens' mobilization. You even had the president at that particular time vetoing a sanctions act, but because of massive mobilization, the U.S. Congress was able to override such a veto. So I think we need to always go back to those lessons, what we have learned in moments of really critical. Even if you look again at the treatment action campaign in South Africa and its influence globally, the most successful movements, you would see that when we bring about political will and combine it with the technical expertise that we have, we are actually able to bring about change. So it's more of thinking about how does change happen. And I think from our submission today is to really get us to look at how do we build a movement that can turn the conversations on Article 109 into a household conversation across the continent in the next year, in the next couple of years. And I believe that there are a number of key pillars that we really need to look at, one of which is building a Pan-African social base for this movement. And that has implications in the languages that we are speaking, the material that we are putting out there. How do we turn this into a conversation that workers can connect to, students can connect to, artists can connect to, people who have all this influence and who are impacted by this dysfunctional and out of date global dispensation. So how do we, turn some of these conference conversations into engagements in town halls, in college campuses, in community halls, on our streets? How do we bring in, video? How do we bring in music, poetry? It's organizing, campaigning 101 that we really need to look at. What do we learn from successful movements like the Jubilee Debt Campaign, for example, how they were able to turn an obscure economic concept into something that ordinary people could connect with and be animated by and organize, and churches every Sunday, they are creating a session where they're talking about this. People are contributing resources to be able to drive this. How do we get our young people on the continent connected to this, interested in this, and really become a part of the movement? And then the second pillar I would suggest has to be global South-to-South solidarity. We have seen again that when we are able to connect at that level, because of our generally shared histories with global oppression, exploitation, the injustices of the global order, we have an objective basis to connect. And I think it's very important that we invest in building those bridges. And when we build this global South-to-South solidarity, we can easily reach the 2/3 threshold that we require to trigger a conversation on Article 109. I'll quickly mention a third pillar that I believe is important, and this is really people-to-people solidarity with progressives in the global north. I think the speaker who went just before me spoke to that in the context of G20. We really need to invest in linking arms with progressive movements in the global north that also want to see democratic global governance. Some of these are movements in the climate justice space, movements in the Palestine solidarity networks, in the debt justice campaigns, in the broader financial architecture reform conversations, unions right now, and the different movements that are talking about a new international economic order. We need to really forge these connections because, again, we have learned that when you have African civil society and global North progressives connecting, global North governments feel the pressure. Sometimes they can ignore us in the global South, but they can't ignore citizens in their capitals, in Brussels, in New York, in London, in Washington, D.C., and all these other spaces. So we really need to invest in that. So not to take too much time, I'll just close by saying we need to go back to campaigning and organizing 101. We need to really look at this from a campaign building point of view. And we need to actually invest in that next generation of African campaign leaders who can take us to the heights that previous movements, as such as the Jubilee movement that I was citing earlier, were able to take us. That's the way that I see us being able to translate this conversation that has advanced to a very good place at a technical level, and in terms of these limited conference spaces, into a mass movement that cannot be ignored. Thank you, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, we needed more than 2 hours for this conversation because I feel it's just beginning. We're just beginning to talk now. So I'll quickly move on to the last 2 speakers, and may I request you to speak for 2.5 minutes each, and then we will be able to have a bit of time for question and answer. So the previous speakers haven't introduced themselves. Briggs Bomba is representing Trust Africa. He's the programs director. And then before Briggs, we had Sanusha Naidu, who was representing the Institute for Global Dialogue based in Pretoria, South Africa. Trust Africa is headquartered in Senegal. Briggs is our brother from across the Zambezi, so he's the other Zambia, Zimbabwe. May I now call upon 2 doctors, and both representing AU ECOSOC. They're part of the leadership of ECOSOC. Dr. Eyole Monono, who is the chair of the cluster for political affairs and based out of Cameroon. And then he will be followed by Dr. Boniface Chembe, who is the chair of the cluster on peace and security based in Lusaka. So again, once again, I know you both have a lot to say, but how do we begin strategizing for African citizens, having heard of the speakers? How do we begin engaging with governments? How do we take this conversation to the African Union? Over to you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Boniface, can we see you and see if we can try on your end? Oh, now we can.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So I was saying now, I want to thank all the panelists that has come before me, and I agree with the conversation. At this point, within the framework of AU ECOSOC, be it the cluster for political and affairs, and also my brother Boniface for peace and security, these 2 clusters have decided to take this reform process within the African context and under AU ECOSOC to see how we can channel the conversation with civil society organization within the continent. And I believe within the plan leading to our next year Citizens Forum, which will be coming up, we believe that we're going to have different engagements in terms of highlighting the importance of African civil society organizations to be part and parcel of this review process. Because one thing which is very important and clear is that we believe that this process is going to strengthen human rights protection, making global governance more inclusive, and also even in terms of the representations of African nations. And so this is very important for African civil society that have been very key when you look at the African Union policy, which tries to put citizens' perspective at the center of it. You understand that within the framework of the reform of the African Union, moving from OAU to AU, the citizens have taken a center stage when it comes to the policy of the organ. And so this makes it very easy for ECOSOC, being an arm of the African Union, which seeks to see how to mobilize the civil society voice. We believe that through our clusters, we are going to seek to push this agenda forward to see that it creates a more effective society, more effective world where the rule of law can be more practicable, which is going to address some of the crises that we have. I agree with some of the conversations that we cannot use a system of 1945 to solve our current problems. I believe that there's need for us to see how to look at what is working, what is not working, and how can we make it better. And I believe this can come only from civil society who have been working from the grassroots level. I believe because at this point, we see that even African civil society organizations are involved in the implementation of the United Nations policies in the continent. And so they have this rapport with many African citizens, and they can speak at this level. And so within the framework of our clusters, we believe that we are providing a platform moving forward, leading to the Citizens Forum next year, where we believe that civil society organizations can come forward to push for this agenda, to make sure that we have a more inclusive global system that is better equipped to promote human rights, the rule of law, which is at this current dispensation, it is being undermined at a certain point. So we believe, not to take the conversation too long, we believe that within the framework of leading to 2026, our roadmap, within the framework of these two clusters and with the Secretariat, we are going to lay down other consultations. And in most of our meetings that we are going to have, we are going to see how this review, Article 109 review process is brought in, so that we can capture as much as possible the voices of the African civil society, and so that we, at the end, we can put this before African head of states to see how we can have a common position, that this is what African citizens are thinking, and this is what they are saying, and this is what they believe it's going to be better for the continent's voice to be heard. Looking at the fact that we are talking about reparation at this point within the African Union, I believe it is coming at a very important point of the life of the continent, where we believe we can push this agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we are very glad that we have the AU ECOSOC Political Affairs Cluster in supporting this. And indeed, we look forward to taking the process forward as we participate in this case, as you are convening, participate in the next Citizens Forum. Boniface, Dr. Boniface Chembe.
Yes, thank you so very much, Madam Chairperson. I hope you can hear me. A very good afternoon to you all. Allow me to ride on all the protocols. Allow me to ride on all the protocols that have been established, and really advance our season's greetings to you all as we are in that time of the year. I think let me adopt all the points that have been put forward by my colleague, Dr. Monono, Cluster Chair for Political Affairs, but also just to add a few things in the interest of time, by stating that the starting point when it comes to addressing strategies for African citizens to engage governments to incorporate Article 109 onto the African Union agenda needs an examination of the core challenges. Again, to just borrow from what Ambassador Pembwa had highlighted. And when it comes to African citizens, there are many obstacles that they face. And among the many include the fact that UN reforms oftentimes seem very distant, technical or irrelevant to daily concerns of their needs, that governments tend to prioritize domestic politics over global governance debates for the most part, although this is changing, as you saw in the highlights that Heba was able to put forward, coming from several different African leaders in terms of what is to be done around the UN. Furthermore, the AU agenda setting tends to be state-centric, requiring effective national lobbying. Again, when we are talking about Article 109, it is extremely limited where awareness is concerned. So these challenges that African citizens face have to be taken into consideration. And whatever strategies that we put in place, which, as my colleague, Dr. Monono, put forward, whatever strategies that you put in place, they have to ensure that we effectively mobilize citizens so that governments are able to gain public pressure and thereby prioritize UN reforms. I'm aware that some countries have done a fairly good job at the government level in terms of prioritizing UN reforms, but we need to do more in all the 55 member states of the African Union to ensure that that public pressure is clear, that Article 109 gains the visibility, but also enters the AU political organs so that it becomes a song, as Briggs put it, and that African states negotiate from a stronger and much more united position. And this will basically ensure that as a continent, we move closer to achieving permanent representation, having greater influence and fairer global governance, if you will. Now, from an ECOSOC standpoint, the beauty when it comes to citizens is that there are several structures that are readily available to provide a leeway for citizen participation. So, for example, in almost all AU member states countries, we've got national chapters, and these are being operationalized very systematically in line with the new regulations that the member states have been approved. So this will provide a leeway through which we can undertake a lot of activities around based on citizens' engagement around Article 109. Within each region of the African continent, we've got deputy presiding officers who work together with cluster chairs, myself and Dr. Monono. Again, that structure is readily available to ensure that we target our citizens to be able to participate in all activities related to Article 109. We've got the membership where citizenship is concerned, or where the citizenry are concerned, throughout the entire continent. And we've got our able secretariat that does a very good job in terms of engagement, mobilization, awareness, creation, but most importantly, that has got very close proximity to the African Union leadership. So through these structures that are available by AU, would be able to make a great deal of impact when it comes to citizens' engagement. So in line or in view of all these, what are some of the strategies that need to be put in place? And very quickly on these strategies have to be looked at two levels. One, at the level of taking care of the interests of African citizens, and two, at the level of taking care of the African or AU member states so that they're able to act robustly where Article 109 is concerned. To that effect, one of the things that we'll have to do in terms of strategy is to create mass awareness building, turning Article 109 into a public conversation. And I'm aware that our secretariat is very good at social media campaigns, is very good at simplifying messages, and is very good at working with different entities such as universities, civic networks, youth organizations, you name it. And of course, in conjunction with us as cluster chairs, we'll be able to create that mass awareness, if you will. Secondly, in line with what the other different participants have put forward, mass mobilization, not only of civil society organizations, but also research networks, ensuring that we channel out policy briefs on Article 109 by way of engaging think tanks, academic institutions, and NGOs, and ensuring that different partners such as ACORD, Codseria, youth networks, among others, are equally involved. Other strategies is to engage parliamentarians and make sure that we take full advantage of the influence to various foreign affairs and governance committees using MPs so that we are as effective as we possibly can, and again, using the readily available channels or structures that the AU ECOSOC.
Sorry, Boniface. I think the internet wants the participants.
Various member states using.
Hi. Can you please summarize now?
Sure. So in sum, and basically as guided, what is important for us is to basically be in a position to ensure that the structures that are available under AU ECOSOC are used extensively and to ensure that the reform process of the global system begins at home, and at home means with Africa citizens, and some of those strategies are the ones that we can use to ensure that there is a citizens lead to the push around Article 109. I thank you.
Colleagues, I won't even attempt to summarize that. Thank you so much, Boniface and Dr. Monono. We will now open up the floor for questions and answers. The first, we have Portia Allen from the floor. Portia, can we please make sure that our contributions are summarized as well?
Thank you, Chair Mofia. Can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yes.
Awesome. Many greetings all. My name is Portia C. Allen. I want to again thank AU ECOSOC. I say again, I would dare say the only one at the international level that is allowing civil society to access these meetings virtually. I know for a fact that UN does not allow this anymore after COVID-19. So thank you, AU ECOSOC. And I'm speaking rapidly to remain in the speaking time frame. Before I share two proposed solutions and one suggestion to add to this discourse, and I want to thank all of the panelists who spoke before me, I want to state something and ask each of us to revisit what we in this room, in person and online, most likely already know. It is that we, Africa and its diaspora, we do not have respected currencies created and maintained and sustained by ourselves for ourselves. It is not a case of us, Africa in its diaspora, one, being unwilling to change for the better. Two, it is not a case of us, Africa in its diaspora, being pessimistic after such oppressive systems that continue to occur and have occurred. And three, it is not a case of us, Africans and its diasporas, remaining in a colonial blame game mindset. Here are the two solutions. One, work with civil society, Africa and its diaspora, especially the civil society that does not attend discussions like so. Yesterday, Monday through Wednesday, UN had a conference. It was through OSAA, and it was a conference about academic discourse at the African level. In that conference, they were saying, yes.
Could you please conclude?
Wrap up. Yeah. They were saying what already was being said here. So the solution is to work with civil society to get a time frame for the solutions that are proposed in these conferences. We're saying the same thing, yet we don't have a time frame nor a budget to implement them. And then the second solution is that a comment is that AU ECOSOC, please revisit the 6 region elections that are proposed in 2026. I yield. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take another question from the room. Any contribution, Mwewa?
Firstly, I'd like to thank the chair, panelists, and all delegates, and all protocol observed. I've heard a lot today, and I would just like to take more a suggestion on a highlight on youth inclusion, because I see youth as a huge constituency and a driver for campaigns, advocacy, and monitoring reforms, because we bring the energy and innovations and legitimacy to help Africa's priorities and reflect them and demand them. As we've been told, the charter was adopted in 1945, and at that time, youth were not a recognized stakeholder. But as we see today, 40% of globally 40%, and with regards to Africa, 70% of it are under 35. That's us, the youth. So I'd say we are the main leaders on AI ethics, cybersecurity, climate actions, and digital governances, which the charter doesn't anticipate or didn't anticipate at the time of its drafting. I would like to suggest maybe a youth council or mechanism that gives us decision-making powers over these policies that impact our future.
There's one who's unapologetically youth activist as well. Yeah, I think we should have also considered having a panelist who is a young person. I'll take two questions from the online participants. We have Abdu and we have Godwin. We'll have those. I can see Sanusha's hand, but before we come to you, I will give Fides. So we in that order. So we'll have Abdu, Godwin, Fides, and then Sanusha. Thank you. Abdu, over to you. You're muted. Abdu, you're muted. Can we move on to Godwin as we wait for Abdu to unmute? Godwin?
All right, thank you very much, and special appreciation to AU ECOSOC. For some of us from this side of the divide, I'm speaking from Nigeria, North Central Plateau State precisely. I'm Godwin Okukwa. I work with Begi Foundation as the Executive Director at National NGO in Nigeria. My questions is to any of the panelists. What do we think of the division among the African leaders in terms of charting a united cause in regards to our conversation? What do we think in terms of the division? And how do we take also into considerations the growing also division and isolations among even African nations? Take, for example, in the ECOWAS states, where currently even within the ECOWAS region, some of the states are pulling out as a result of the system of governance in operation. Through how do we think we can facilitate this initiative through digitally youth-led advocacy? What can it take into? And then lastly, in terms of the rule of law, who enforces the law? I think that even at the United Nations, this has been the gap in terms of implementations of adherence to rule of law and also implementations or enforcement of the law. Also in this regard, who does that? Thank you, and over.
Abdu, if you can unmute. Okay, Fides.
Okay, thank you very much. I heard all the speakers allude to and giving a clarion call for mobilization of civil society actors across Africa. And we heard Heba talk about the timelines. I wanted to find out how you intend to mobilize civil society actors across the continent. Is there a roadmap? And secondly, it's around financing, looking at the current donor landscaping and the shrinking civic space for civil society actors, but also withdrawal of funding for advocacy for civil society actors. Is there a specific mechanism to ensure that the civil society actors that will be part of this process are financed to have a two-pronged approach where these campaigns are done at probably country level, because sometimes it's easy for us to do activism at regional and global level, and yet these are some of the issues that are glaring in our faces at country level and we can't face them. So is there a mechanism of us doing activism at country level, aligning it to regional level and continental level? Thank you.
Thank you. Sanusha?
Thank you very much, Chair. Mine is a very short intervention and I'm not going to be able to answer the questions. So if that's okay, I was just thinking that a possible way to try and get the review kind of onto the AU agenda is what we found at the social summit, where there were legacy projects that were put onto South Africa's G20 agenda that will then be taken forward as part of a continuous engagement. So this could actually be a possible way in which ECOSOC works with, I know they're working with the AU, but to get the AU to keep this review of the charter on the agenda, because the AU is a member of the G20 now, and to use that space more strategically as a legacy project. And that could be something that could be definitely mobilized through civil society as well, and in that context. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have Gusto? Then I will give an opportunity to the panelists.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, mine is just a comment. And yes, my name is Aganston Chola from Mondola. My comment is how best is we can see that ECOSOC can push AU so that governments are able to also assist in terms of coming up with a civil societies where they are supported. Because as we know that most of the governments are able to come in the way of helping and seeing that these civil societies who have got the mark and all the stuff. Because we see that in most of the countries, you find that government try to distance themselves from working with civil societies because of maybe sometimes of political inclination or not. So how can AU help to make sure that the governments are able to assist civil societies in this work of advocacy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Several questions there. I will request, I can't see whether Heba is still online. If not, I'll request Dr. Prof. Tim Murithi to respond to some of the questions that have been raised around the roadmap and the funding, and anything else that you would speak to from the questions.
I'll try to be brief because I know time is not on our side. Brenda, thank you so much for moderating this session with the usual alacrity and style. Very quickly, a roadmap to mobilizing civil society across the continent. This is an excellent idea. It's not something we've applied our minds to, so we don't have a specific response to you, but you're in the right room within ECOSOC, who could be definitely an anchor partner with the Article 109 other civil society organizations. If you're keen to support this, please very much keep in touch with the ECOSOC team and obviously Madam Brenda, who is there to push this agenda forward. On youth, I just want to very strongly endorse the need for us to actually, for the youth themselves, I don't think we can do anything when it comes to youth. We must just ask the youth themselves to take up the challenge posed by this call to action and to leverage their own abilities to research, analyze, advocate, mobilize our societies, tapping into the Gen Z energy that we've witnessed in a number of our countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, making full use of social media to communicate to their peers and wider society. We really need to make this a household conversation, a community conversation. So concretely, youth actors can convene Article 109 youth clubs that can meet, whether virtually, in person, local communities to raise awareness. Coalition members would be happy to jump in when they can to engage and also learn from the youth actors who have demonstrated their capacity to organize digitally. And on this basis, I think youth actors can proactively become co-creators and co-architects in the transformation of the global governance structures. When it comes to our African governments, clearly we need to work again through ECOSOC, I would argue, to engage our political leaders, diplomatic and political leaders, to actually put this issue on the agenda of the African Union, a permanent representatives committee in Addis Ababa, in New York, in Geneva, and the C10 convening Assembly of Heads of State committee of 10 working on UN Security Council reform, but also the Peace and Security Council, all major structures of the AU to take this agenda forward. And this is not a civil society agenda. This is an African agenda, a Pan-African agenda, and I very much concur with the speaker who spoke about creating a Pan-African social-based social campaign to turn this movement, Article 109, into a African people movement, linking up with Global South solidarity actors and the Global North allies who are committed to this cause. So yes, I think this is it's been a wonderful engagement with all colleagues, and I look forward to remaining in touch with all of you and learning also from you how we can best push and take this agenda item forward. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. There was a question, and I don't know who can take this question, about the divisions among African leaders. How do we handle that?
I think you would be the best place, Brenda, to take that specific question.
No, before we talk about any African leaders, I think we should just ask about our own governments and our own leaders. If we can just start with that, the UN engagement for many of our countries is a huge investment. If you engaged at the UN level, then you would see that even the smallest country does have a presence at the UN and has staff that is even bigger than what you see in Addis Ababa. New York is very expensive. So if we're going to invest our tax money into having Ambassador Kapambwe and several other colleagues that are engaging the UN, then certainly we need a conversation on Article 109. If we can all do that, then maybe the second step can be about how these African countries can begin talking about the same, and they can unite a little bit more around 109. Because if we have the comrade we had from Nigeria engaging his own country and mobilizing at that level, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and we all do that, it's certainly our governments will be pushed to unite. But as for the divisions, maybe that's another conversation. But right now, I think the focus has to be, let's concentrate on our governments. Unless Ambassador Kapambo would like to say something as well. Let me back.
Thank you very much. I would like to just give the assurance that the African leaders are not as divided whenever they have a common African position. But how do you bring about a common African position? Because on Security Council reform, they still continue to stand together because there is a common African position. The same thing when they were working on Agenda 2030, the SDGs. The African leaders were able to stand together and present one common position. The issue is, how do you get items onto the agenda of the African Union. And in this respect, ECOSOC, being one of the advisory bodies of the AU, does have the capacity to bring agenda items onto the summit of the AU. And with good preparation of what should constitute an African common position, you can get a summit to approve an agenda item, obviously through working with the PRC, the Permanent Representatives Committee. The other way to bring an item on the agenda of the African Union Summit is through an item called items proposed by member states. You can lobby a member state, any member state, to sponsor an item. And that is allowed at any time at the African Union. The issue, therefore, is, do we have African common positions on the various issues that we would like addressed? And that is where the role of the African Union Commission is also very important, because many of the leaders, when they come to attend the AU, are first and foremost coming as representatives of their countries. So they come to the AU not to deal with the Pan-Africanist issues, but essentially to bring their national perspectives on whatever it is. But if the African Union Commission, through the various commissions and departments, have presented proposals to the summit, the chances of the summit adopting those are very high, and therefore creating a common African position. So let us identify the issues that we would like addressed under the 109 initiative. And as I said earlier, we need to look at charter. There are certain things in the charter that we may wish to amend. Then there are issues relating to the United Nations itself that we would like to reform so that they can then be captured within the charter that will emerge out of the process. If we can work on position papers like that, it becomes easier to sell these position papers and transform them as common African positions, which are adopted by the summit of the AU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question that was raised on funding and whether there is resources available to support some advocacy, given the sector's experience currently. I was hoping that that would be answered by our last speaker that was supposed to take us through how to get involved in Article 109, so that he was supposed to outline some of the avenues of mobilizing and how to get involved, but I don't see him there. Simon, are you there?
Hi, Brenda.
Hello.
Yes.
Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, so before you come, Simon, just 1 minute. I think we have a hand in the room. So let me just give an opportunity to Father Mutale to ask his question, and then we can come to you. Unfortunately, colleagues, we've run out of time, so this will be my last. This will be the last intervention, and then we'll move on to Simon, and then we'll close the meeting.
Thank you. This is Father Mwamba Mutale of the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection. And may I just say all protocols observed. Listening to this rich conversation, what I see from where I stand, where I sit, is an opportunity. And in this opportunity for the initiative on Article 109 collision, I'm just saying something we already know or have experienced before, the role of faith-based organizations, particularly when it comes to Africa. And I'm speaking about faith-based organizations of all shapes and sizes, think tanks, collisions, and of different faith traditions from Cape to Cairo, as it were. I was really excited when I heard reference to the Jubilee campaign, and we've seen it before. So as we help to, make this conversation, this discourse, seem closer to the people, let's remember the role of a faith-based organization. We are close to the people. We speak their language. We are with them in their joys and sorrows. We, in some cases, have the expertise that can be leveraged, and we've done that before. So as part of the strategy, I'm saying that let us make sure that faith-based or faith-inspired institutions are also part of this conversation as we break down the technicalities, bring this closer to the people, and ensure that we make it matter and explain it in a way that is intelligible and that can be appreciated very easily. Very good initiative. I look forward to joining it. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Mutale. Yes, indeed. And we will never forget the fact that the Catholic or JCTR, for that matter, played a huge role in mobilizing citizens around the Jubilee movement. So I believe it's not just the role, but also the experience in galvanizing the people and in ensuring that a global moment is created and global change is actually achieved. So thank you so much for that intervention. Colleagues, please, those that are in the room, we have an opportunity to interact more. So from here, we're going to move downstairs. We have some refreshments, wine.
Brenda Simon is still to speak.
So we have some refreshments downstairs. So we'll continue with this conversation. But over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Brenda. Can I also have some of the wine? I'm kidding. But thank you, everyone, for joining. So I'll make this quick, but I wanted to briefly share how we can actually support the coalition. So try to simplify the ways that we can do this. And essentially, in order to support the Article 109 coalition, you can do it through two avenues. So one is endorsing the coalition's vision, and the other is becoming a formal coalition partner. So we'll deep dive on what these actually mean. So for the first one, endorsing the coalition's vision, what this essentially mean is you as individuals or eventually as organizations will be adding your voice in this growing number of organizations, whether it's civil society or even member states, who are actually calling for the renewal of the UN Charter. So, of course, this still has some nuances. So, what does this actually look like in practice? So, first, you have to agree with the vision of the coalition, which is to be able to trigger Article 109 and have a charter review conference. This may also mean that your logo may appear on the website as our partners or as our endorsers for charter reform. And of course, you will be invited to the coalition's events or opportunities to, for example, have some campaigning or have some signatories for calls. And last but not least, you'll be advocating for charter reform in your own circles. So we understand that each organization or each stakeholder has their own ways of doing so. So what's important is we give the necessary tools to enable organizations to be able to do that. So of course, there's a lot more, and we can schedule a call or have a deep dive on how we can do this. But another way that we can support the coalition is to be a formal partner. So this means that beyond endorsing charter reform or Article 109, you want to be actively involved. So what does that mean? Essentially, this can look like providing financial or in-kind support. So whether you're a funding organization or being able to give in-kind support, for example, you have extra manpower or resources, researchers who can do support in terms of providing content and strengthening the evidence. That's a way that we can do it. You can co-organize events like what we are doing right here. You can co-organize events with the Article 109 Coalition. And of course, since it's a coalition, you'll be able to co-design the coalition strategy, how we move forward. We want to make sure that the voices of different regions are heard because, of course, context is different. And we want to be able to strengthen our strategy in a way that appeases these different cultural and other nuances. This also means you're supporting or leading an advocacy project. So it can be a research project, it can be a funding opportunity, and this can be national or regional in level. And of course, we're doing the hard work to be able to trigger a conference, but eventually we will have to do the other hard work, which is the next phase. And of course, as a coalition partner, you'll be able to provide input on what a revised UN Charter would actually look like. So, for example, for the African countries, what does a UN Charter that reflects the needs and voice of the African people look like? So this is, of course, at a much later stage, but we would be happy for everyone to join. So for the last, I would highly encourage people to scan the QR code so you can sign up to our newsletter where we give updates and news on our different activities, events, and of course, like I mentioned, you can endorse charter renewal. You can also scan that QR code so that you can begin the process of going into the two paths. So this is the rundown, a very quick snapshot of how we can collaborate and work together. But thank you so much for the time and for all the stimulating conversations from today. So I'll give it back to Brenda.
Thank you very much. I was, in the absence of Heba, I was requested to summarize key takeaways from this meeting. We began this meeting with some, what I would call voice of reason. We were welcomed, but we also had Ambassador Lazarus Kapambwe coming strongly to challenge us to identify the mischiefs. What is it that we are trying to change? Throughout the conversations that we've had, I think that registered in so many people's interventions, and constantly we tried as much as possible to respond to the issue of mischief. What is it? Several things have come out. There is consensus that we are dealing with a UN that probably will not go anywhere anytime soon. A UN whose decisions and reach is affecting us. Briggs emphasized that this is a life and death issue. The decisions of the UN are peace and security issues for most people. The decisions of the UN are also an issue of whether you are independent or not. You know, our friends of Western Sahara, for example, who were recognized by the AU in 1982, they cannot be a state because the UN hasn't decided. Our friends Palestinians, they cannot be a state because the UN has not decided, and that's a charter problem. We're dealing with a dysfunctional global order that's right now going through a lot. The system itself is challenged a lot, not because there are certain things and developments that we are experiencing now that were not there in 1945 when the charter was put in place and the UN was established, but also because decisions within the UN as enshrined by the charter, they don't present effectiveness. Somebody, without saying it, raised the issue of rule of law and said, how come there's evidence that there's impunity? Because the charter hasn't perhaps chartered and catered sufficiently for making sure that there's accountability there. So we're dealing with a framework that has not just left out certain issues that have since its establishment or its adoption arisen and are currently providing some challenges in the case of climate change, case of AI and many others, but we're also dealing with a system that's so unequal that favors certain and promotes, it favors certain voices and promotes certain regions at the expense of our continent. And our continent certainly needs and would want to see a more effective and a stronger voice within the UN. We also spoke about the narrative. Yes, we want to, as civil society, we feel there's an opportunity for us to engage, but how do we do this? Briggs Bomber talked about the need for us to have a Pan-African social base. He said the conversation has to meaningfully reflect what we want. And he also talked about the need for us to partner with the global South, South to South cooperation, and also the need for us to recognize that in doing so, it will be necessary, and historically it has always been necessary, that we join forces with progressive forces in the global North. We also unpacked Article 109. So we won't go into that detail. Heba ran us through, even looking at some of the questions that have risen in how we can go around certain challenges that that article provides in ensuring that a charter conference or a UN conference to review the charter does happen, and what we can do in overcoming the issue and of veto and the powers that have been given to the P5. There was also a push that we need to make sure that in bringing this agenda to the African agenda, to become an African agenda, we need to understand the system. In his last remarks, Ambassador Kapambwe talked about us understanding and utilizing frameworks that are already existing, utilizing the AU ECOSOC as an advisory body to push and make sure that perhaps we should be talking about a common African position on this. In all this, what I picked up myself is the power of citizens, the power that we have as African citizens and African NGOs in pushing our own governments, but in perhaps recognizing that this is a moment when we should come together, as we have always done, to push for Article 109 to be evoked. Simon has laid out how you can become part of this coalition. It's not exhaustive. We ran out of time, but those of us that are in the room are invited downstairs to network further. Those of you that are online, we've lost quite a number of people, but I hope you did get the details and you were able to get the details of how you can join. But in any case, this meeting was put together by organizations that we're all part of. Thank you very much once again, AU ECOSOC. I have a lot to say about AU ECOSOC, but right now when I sit in New York, I'm always very proud that at least we have a citizens, an African citizens organ that is meaningfully not just engaging at this level, but actually connecting and meaningfully also speaking for us at global levels. So thank you very much, AU ECOSOC. Let us know how we can be reinforced and be part of your efforts. Thank you again. I'm not going to thank Article 109 because I'm part of it. Otherwise, I'll be thanking myself. But let me thank Trust Africa, a very reliable partner on the African continent. We all heard the voice of Briggs Bomba. That is Trust Africa. So Briggs Bomba, if you're online, we're looking forward to working with you. The AU Summit is coming. It's round the corner in February, which is 2 months from now. Let's take advantage of every moment that we have to make the call for Article 109 as part of the song. And thank you very much. I know I mentioned AU ECOSOC, but thank you very much to our two cluster, the heads of the cluster, the political affairs and peace and security. We look forward to working with you as well. And last but not the least, there was mention, I think, from Boniface, Dr. Boniface, that there's soon going to be operationalization of national chapters of AU ECOSOC. So I hope we can continue engaging and not just with the Secretariat, but also using those platforms and national chapters once they're operationalized to continue demanding for a renewed United Nations. You know, when we talk about United Nations, it should be truly United Nations that are equal. Africa has 54 countries there. If all things were equal, we would be talking about 55. It's the one single largest region in the UN. So thank you once again for the opportunity to facilitate this conversation and this event. I look forward to more engagements. Back to you, William.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brenda. I think you have moderated this session brilliantly and you've done justice to the session. But allow me also to just share some concluding reflection, just in addition to some of the views that Brenda have shared. First is to also join Brenda to thank those in the room and participants who join us online. Indeed, what these have indicated is that we are ready as Africans to not only participate in the global governance, but also to reshape it in a way that we're going to move things further as citizens. Over the symposium, we have basically traversed the past, interrogate the present, and imagine the future of the international system. We had, like what Brenda said, Ambassador Lazarus remind us that we must distinguish between reforming the United Nations and renewing the UN Charter. I think for me, two different but interlinked missions that determine the kind of global system we are fighting for. And Professor Timothy indicates that the current Security Council is a danger to humanity, and warning that an unreformed multilateral order is no longer fit for purpose in addressing conflicts from Sudan to Somalia, or global threats like AI and the climate catastrophe, which we are talking about. EBA also continue to use the 1945 charter to deal with the 2025 challenge. She said it's like using a typewriter in the days of a smartphone world. So she reminded us that Article 109 indeed offers a rare and historic entry point where Africa can mobilize. And when we talk about Africa mobilize, we're talking about the citizens, not later, not someday, but now. And I want to particularly appreciate Sanusha, who grounded his global conversation in the concrete realities of domestic politics. And she reminded us that the local is global and the global is local. And then she spoke candidly on the tensions South Africa has navigated in aligning domestic priorities with its international footprint from the G20 to BRICS, and highlighted how think tanks, civil society, and regional institutions can basically amplify Africa's influence and build momentum at national and continental level. And a challenge was very clear. If Africans want to shape the world, Africa must first mobilize at home. Thank you very much. We also heard from Briggs Bomba, who reminded us that political will does not fall from the sky. It is built by people. It powerfully recalled that major global shift from sanctions against apartheid to global health movement only succeeded when citizens mobilized and movement demanded action. That is the spirit we must reclaim. Colleagues, the message today is unmistakable. Africa does not want a louder voice in a broken system. Africa wants a central role in building a better system, a system where equity is real and not rhetorical, a system where sovereign equity is respected, a system where global threats are met with global responsibility, a system where African lives, African ideas, and African agencies matter. For too long, the world has operated on structure designed without Africa at the table. As Eba reminded us, only 4 African states were present when the charter was adopted. Today, Africa represents more than a quarter of the UN membership and yet remains structurally marginalized. Article 109 offers the path to concrete or to correct historical injustices and rebuild global governance for the next century. But this will not happen by technical proposal alone. It requires what BRICS call a Pan-African social base, like Brenda rightly said. Artists, youth, academics, workers, parliamentarians, the faith-based organization, journalists, traditional leaders, digital influencers, and our vast diaspora all must carry this conversation. So I leave you with these 3 challenges. Let us normalize the idea of UN Charter reform across Africa, not just in panels like this, but in radio talk shows, in parliament, in universities, in our WhatsApp group, and in our community forums. And institutions like ActionAid does this better with their grassroots intervention and engagement. Let us build alliances across borders and sectors. As Sanusi reminded us, South Africa experience in G20 BRICS, a national institution, regional institution, shows the power of aligning domestic priorities with continental ambition. Lastly, let us mobilize a movement that makes it politically impossible to ignore Africa's demand for justice. Political will follows people, movement creates mandate. Colleagues, if the world is running on outdated software, then we have a responsibility to help write the next version. And therefore, I think you have a responsibility. If the UN is indeed, as Eba warned us, limping into its 80th year, then Africa must inject the courage and imagination needed to renew it. And if the system as it stands is failing to deliver peace, justice, and human dignity, then borrowing from Mandela, we must make what seems impossible inevitable. On behalf of ECOSOC, I want to thank you for your commitment, your bravery, your belief that Africa can lead this global movement. Let us live not merely in form, but mobilize, which is more fundamental. The future of multilateralism will not be decided for Africa. It will be decided with Africa or not at all. Let us work forward together and let us get to work now. Thank you very much. And we invited you down there for not wine, unless if wine has come all the way from New York, but you can get some sodas that will not actually affect or give you any problem with regards to the sugar level going beyond the normal energy. So you're welcome at the poolside. Thank you very much once again.